Stop crying. He was miserable and my brother was a loser. I did you all a favor.
For your total lack of remorse, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Richard Wright was a pillar of the New Mexico judicial system. His son Thomas was 14. But on that March morning in 2022, Cochiti Lake told a different story. Father and son floated face down near the private dock, their bodies growing cold in the early spring water. 16-year-old Emma Wright stood on the shore in designer clothes, completely dry, telling first responders she'd tried to pull them out. Detective Caleb Roberts had 15 years in homicide. He noticed the details, not a drop of water on her. The girl was lying, and the truth was still submerged. "So you were in the house studying when this happened?" Detective Roberts asked, his experienced eyes scanning the scene, as a crime scene technicians photographed the bodies that had now been pulled to shore. Emma nodded, her blonde hair catching the morning sun, her blue eyes wide but strangely devoid of tears as she clutched a monogrammed cashmere throw around her shoulders despite the mild temperature. "I had a chemistry test coming up on Monday when we get back from spring break," she explained, her voice steady and controlled. "Dad was always on me about my grades, so I was trying to get ahead." Roberts made a note of her composure, which seemed unusual for a teenager who had just discovered her remaining family members dead, particularly given that her mother had died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving Emma effectively orphaned. If you're watching this video, please hit that subscribe button to follow more true crime investigations like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we dive into one of New Mexico's most shocking family murders. The Wright family lake house stood as a testament to generational wealth and success, with its modern architecture and expansive windows providing panoramic views of the water and mountains beyond. The family compound had been in the Wright family for decades, passed down through 3 generations of legal professionals who had shaped the judicial landscape of Bernalillo County and beyond. The property featured a main house, a guest cottage, and a boathouse with a private dock, all positioned on 5 acres of prime lakefront land that had been purchased by Emma's grandfather, the first Judge Wright, back in the 1970s, when he began building what would become known as the Wright Dynasty in New Mexico's legal circles. As officers secured the crime scene with yellow tape that fluttered in the gentle breeze coming off the water, neighbors gathered at the property line, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity at the tragedy that had befallen one of Albuquerque's most respected families. "Did you notice anything unusual before you found them?" Roberts asked, watching as the medical examiner began her preliminary examination of the bodies on the shore. Emma shrugged slightly, an action that seemed incongruous with the situation, almost as if she were being asked about a missing homework assignment rather than the deaths of her father and brother. "Dad and Thomas were going fishing this morning," she replied, gesturing toward a tackle box that lay overturned on the dock, its contents scattered across the wooden planks. "I heard them leave the house around 7 a.m., but I was focused on my studies, so I didn't go with them." Detective Roberts nodded, making notes in his small black notebook while observing how Emma's gaze never lingered on the bodies of her father and brother, instead scanning the growing number of police vehicles and the drone that was now capturing aerial footage of the crime scene. The serenity of Cochiti Lake stood in stark contrast to the grim tableau unfolding on its shores, as more investigators arrived and began processing what was initially being called a tragic accident. The Wright family had been spending their spring break at the lake house, a tradition that had continued even after the death of Emma's mother, Catherine, who had succumbed to an aggressive form of breast cancer when Emma was just 13. Judge Richard Wright, 52, had been appointed to the circuit court bench 6 years earlier, following in the footsteps of both his father and grandfather, and was known for his fair but firm approach to criminal cases, particularly those involving juvenile offenders. Thomas Wright, a freshman at Albuquerque Academy, was by all accounts a bright and promising student, already showing signs that he might one day continue the family's legal legacy with his straight-A performance and recent selection for a prestigious youth law program at the University of New Mexico. "Emma, can you walk me through exactly what happened when you found them?" Detective Roberts asked, moving away from the immediate crime scene to a patio area where they could speak more privately. Emma sat down on a wrought iron chair, arranging her throw blanket around her shoulders with careful precision before recounting her story. "I was in my room studying until about 9:30 this morning when I realized I hadn't heard them come back in," she began, her voice maintaining its steady cadence as a hummingbird darted past them toward a nearby feeder. "I thought maybe they'd gone into town for something, but then I saw Dad's wallet and keys were still on the kitchen counter, so I went down to the dock to check." She paused, taking a sip from a water bottle that an officer had provided, her hand remarkably steady for someone who had supposedly just experienced profound trauma. "That's when I saw them in the water, not moving. I tried calling to them, and when they didn't respond, I tried to reach them, but they were too far out." Detective Roberts noted that Emma claimed to have called 911 immediately after finding her father and brother, but a quick check with dispatch had revealed the call had come in at 10:13 a.m., which would become a crucial detail later in the investigation. The detective's attention was drawn to Emma's phone, which she kept checking discreetly throughout their conversation, her thumbs occasionally moving across the screen in what appeared to be text messages or social media activity. "Do you mind if I take a look at your phone, Emma?" Roberts asked, extending his hand in what seemed like a casual request, but was actually a calculated move to gauge her reaction. Emma hesitated, her first display of genuine emotion flickering across her face as she clutched the device a bit tighter before reluctantly handing it over with a shrug that seemed forced. "Sure, I guess," she replied, her eyes following the phone as Roberts took it, "but I don't see how that helps figure out how they drowned." As crime scene technicians meticulously documented the scene, the medical examiner, Dr. Naomi Patel, approached Detective Roberts with a concerned expression that immediately suggested this was more than a simple drowning accident. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," she said quietly, leading him away from Emma and back toward the bodies of Richard and Thomas Wright, which had been placed in black zippered bags but remained unzipped for further examination. Dr. Patel knelt beside Judge Wright's body and carefully turned his head to reveal a significant depression fracture at the base of his skull, the damaged area visible even to Robert's untrained eye. "This isn't consistent with a fall into water or striking something while drowning," Dr. Patel explained, her voice low enough that only Roberts could hear. "This type of injury would have rendered him unconscious or killed him instantly, and it appears to have been caused by a heavy object with a defined edge, not something you'd typically find in a natural setting like rocks in the lake." The lakeside compound quickly transformed from a vacation retreat into a full-scale crime scene as additional detectives, forensic specialists, and the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office representatives arrived to assist with what was now officially a suspicious death investigation. Detective Roberts instructed officers to escort Emma Wright to the guest cottage and remain with her while he conferred with the growing team of investigators, the weight of handling a case involving a sitting judge's death already creating pressure from Department brass, who had been calling his cell phone nonstop since the initial report. "We need to treat this like a homicide until proven otherwise," Roberts told his partner, Detective Maria Sanchez, as they watched crime scene technicians place evidence markers around the dock and shoreline. The ME found blunt force trauma to the judge's head that doesn't match accidental drowning, and something about the daughter's demeanor isn't sitting right with me. The initial canvass of the property revealed several concerning elements that heightened investigators' suspicions about the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Richard and Thomas Wright. In the boathouse, officers discovered that a metal boat anchor was missing from its usual storage spot, with only dust outlines indicating where it should have been hanging, according to a maintenance schedule posted on the wall. Detective Sanchez found wet footprints leading from the dock to the main house that did not match the size of either victim's feet, but did appear consistent with Emma's shoe size, contradicting her claim that she hadn't gone near the water until discovering the bodies. The team also noted that while fishing gear was indeed scattered on the dock, as Emma had described, the configuration seemed staged, tackle boxes opened but with lures arranged too neatly, fishing rods placed at perfect parallel angles, and no bait present despite an upcoming fishing excursion. Detective Roberts, "You should see this," called a tech officer who had been examining the house's security system, his laptop open to display footage from that morning. The property's security cameras had captured Judge Wright and Thomas walking down to the dock at approximately 7:15 a.m., just as Emma had stated. But contrary to her account of studying in her room all morning, the footage also showed her leaving the main house at 7:32 a.m. and heading in the same direction. The camera covering the dock itself appeared to have been disabled, showing only static from 7:40 a.m. until 9:17 a.m. when it suddenly began functioning again, a gap in surveillance that immediately raised red flags for the investigation team. The officer pointed to additional footage showing Emma returning to the main house at 9:20 a.m., entering through a side door rather than the main entrance, and appearing to change her clothes before emerging again at 10:10 a.m., only 3 minutes before she called 911. As darkness fell over Cochiti Lake, casting long shadows across the crime scene, Detective Roberts returned to the guest cottage where Emma Wright had been waiting with a female officer who reported the girl had spent most of the time on her phone before the device was officially taken as potential evidence. "Emma, we need to go through a few more details about this morning," Roberts began, sitting across from her at a small table while Detective Sanchez stood near the doorway, both officers having noted that Emma had changed into fresh clothes and applied makeup during their absence. "Our initial investigation has uncovered some inconsistencies with your earlier statement, and I'm hoping you can help clear those up." Emma's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly as she crossed her legs and leaned back in her chair, a defensive position that Roberts had seen countless times in his interrogation room back at headquarters. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Emma asked, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge as she tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, a delicate diamond stud catching the light of the cottage's lamp. Detective Roberts placed his notebook on the table and flipped to a clean page, maintaining eye contact with Emma as he prepared to observe her reactions to his questions. "For starters, our security footage shows you leaving the main house and heading toward the dock at 7:32 this morning, not studying in your room as you previously stated," he said, his tone remaining conversational rather than accusatory. Emma's eyes widened briefly before she composed herself, a flash of calculation crossing her features as she formulated her response. "Oh, right, I forgot about that. I did go down to tell them I wanted breakfast before they left, but they had already pushed off in the boat, so I went back to the house to study." Detective Sanchez stepped forward, her expression skeptical as she placed crime scene photos of the dock on the table between Emma and Roberts. "That's interesting, because we found no evidence that a boat was taken out this morning," she said, pointing to images of the boathouse interior, where all vessels remained secured in their lifts. "And the security camera covering the dock was disabled from 7:40 until 9:17? Do you know anything about that?" Emma's composure faltered momentarily, a faint flush creeping up her neck as she glanced between the two detectives, her right hand unconsciously moving to fidget with a gold chain around her neck, that held a small pendant with her initials. "I don't know anything about cameras or boats," she replied, her voice slightly higher than before. "Maybe Dad and Thomas were just fishing from the dock instead of taking the boat out. I didn't actually see them, I just knew they were going fishing." The questioning continued well into the night, with Emma's story evolving with each inconsistency the detectives presented, her initial calm facade gradually giving way to irritation and defensive responses. When confronted with the wet footprints matching her shoe size, she claimed she had tried to wade into the water to help her father and brother, but couldn't swim well enough to reach them, contradicting her earlier statement about not approaching the water until she called 911. When asked about the 43-minute gap between her discovery of the bodies and her emergency call, Emma became visibly agitated, insisting she had been in shock and trying to process what happened before being able to make the call. The detectives exchanged knowing glances as Emma's explanations grew increasingly convoluted, the girl seemingly unaware that her digital footprint would soon tell a very different story than the one she was frantically trying to construct. As the interview approached midnight, Emma Wright's demeanor had transformed from the composed, almost detached teenager who had greeted first responders to a visibly exhausted and increasingly hostile young woman who demanded to know if she was under arrest or free to go. "I've answered all your questions over and over," she said, pushing back from the table and standing abruptly, her voice rising in what appeared to be practiced indignation. "My father and brother just died, and instead of letting me grieve, you're treating me like a criminal." Detective Roberts remained seated, his expression impassive as he observed the performance unfolding before him, having seen similar displays of manufactured outrage from suspects when they felt their narratives crumbling. "No one is treating you like a criminal, Emma," he replied calmly, gathering his notes as Detective Sanchez moved subtly to position herself between Emma and the door. "But as the only witness to a very unusual double drowning, your account is crucial to understanding what happened to your family." The morning after the deaths of Richard and Thomas Wright brought a flurry of activity to the Albuquerque Police Department as digital forensic specialists began their examination of Emma Wright's iPhone, which had been seized as evidence the previous night. Detective Caleb Roberts stood behind technical analyst Jen Pham as she navigated through the device's contents, bypassing the password protection with a warrant-approved extraction tool that downloaded the phone's complete data history to the department's secure server. She was definitely active on social media yesterday morning during the time she claimed to be finding the bodies, Pham noted, pulling up Emma's Instagram account, which showed several posts made between 9:30 and 10:10 a.m. on March 5th. The most damning piece of evidence appeared on the screen, a selfie posted at 9:43 a.m., showing Emma with a slight smirk, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and the lake dock clearly visible in the background captioned, "Spring Break Study Break, Lake House, Just a Rich Girl Problems." That puts her at the scene during the exact window when she claimed to be discovering the bodies and panicking, Detective Roberts said, pointing to the timestamp on the post that directly contradicted Emma's statement about finding her father and brother at 9:30 a.m. The forensic analysis revealed more damning evidence as they scrolled through deleted text messages that had been recovered from the phone's cache, showing conversations between Emma and a friend named Zoe, where Emma complained bitterly about her father cutting off her allowance. "Can't believe he's taking away my $500 a week just BC of some stupid grades," read one message sent 3 days before the incident. "He says I can't have it back until I demonstrate academic improvement, like I'm some charity case. Like I don't deserve what's mine." The exchange continued with increasingly hostile comments about Judge Wright, including one sent the night before the drownings that read, "Tomorrow everything changes, Dunn being the family disappointment, while Golden Boy gets everything handed to him." By mid-afternoon, the technical team had uncovered the browser history from Emma's phone and laptop, revealing searches from the previous week that sent a chill through the investigation team. Inheritance timeline when parent dies. Do minors get life insurance money immediately? How long does probate take? And perhaps most disturbing, can Anchor crack skull? Were among the queries Emma had researched in the days leading up to her father and brother's deaths. Detective Sanchez compiled the digital evidence into a comprehensive report, while Roberts consulted with the district attorney's office about next steps, the mounting evidence shifting the case from suspicious deaths to what was clearly premeditated murder. "We have enough for an arrest warrant," Assistant District Attorney Jackson Davis confirmed over the phone, his voice grave as he processed the evidence against the 16-year-old daughter of his former colleague. "Bring her in, and we'll need to determine immediately whether to charge her as an adult, given the severity and calculation involved." The arrest of Emma Wright took place at her maternal aunt's home in the affluent North Valley neighborhood of Albuquerque, where she had been staying since being released from initial questioning the previous night. Detective Roberts and a team of officers arrived at the Spanish-style estate at 4:30 p.m., finding Emma lounging by the pool with her phone in hand, appearing to be online shopping for a new handbag, the tragedy of just 36 hours earlier seemingly far from her mind. "Emma Wright, you're under arrest for the murders of Richard and Thomas Wright," Roberts announced, his voice firm as he approached the pool area while uniformed officers secured the perimeter. Emma's aunt, Catherine's sister, let out a strangled cry of shock from the patio doorway, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief, but Emma herself showed little reaction beyond a momentary widening of her eyes before she carefully placed her phone on the lounge chair and stood to face the detective. "This is ridiculous," Emma said as Detective Sanchez recited her Miranda rights, her voice carrying the same entitled tone that characterized her social media presence. The officers allowed her to change from her swimsuit into appropriate clothing before escorting her to the waiting police vehicle, news cameras already gathering at the property gates as word of the high-profile arrest spread through local media channels. As Emma was placed in the back of the unmarked police car, her expression finally betrayed genuine emotion, not grief or shock at being accused of killing her family, but unmistakable anger at being caught. Detective Roberts, who had witnessed countless reactions from murderers facing justice, found her response particularly disturbing given her age, the coldness in her eyes reminiscent of hardened criminals 3 times her age. The processing of Emma Wright at the Juvenile Detention Center was completed by early evening. Her fingerprints and mugshot entered into the system as news of her arrest dominated local broadcasts across New Mexico. Behind closed doors at the district attorney's office, Prosecutor Jackson Davis reviewed the evidence with his team, the details of the case painting a disturbing picture of a privileged teenager who had methodically planned and executed the murder of her father and brother for financial gain. "The Instagram selfie is our smoking gun," Davis noted, examining the time-stamped photo that placed Emma at the crime scene during the time she claimed to be discovering the bodies. "But we need to establish the full timeline and determine if the brother's death was part of the original plan or a crime of opportunity when he witnessed his father's murder." The following morning, the forensics team at Cochiti Lake made a breakthrough discovery that would further solidify the case against Emma Wright when they located the missing boat anchor hidden in a storage closet of the detached garage, the metal surface reeking of bleach but still showing traces of blood in the crevices when subjected to luminol testing. She attempted to clean it, but didn't realize blood seeps into the small spaces in metal, the lead forensic technician explained to Detectives Roberts and Sanchez as she carefully packaged the anchor for transport to the lab. Preliminary testing indicates the blood is human, and based on the pattern of staining, this is almost certainly our murder weapon. The garage also yielded an empty bottle of bleach with Emma's fingerprints and a scrubbing brush with both bleach residue and biological material trapped in the bristles, suggesting a hasty cleanup attempt in the hours following the murders. The Ring doorbell camera from the neighboring lake house provided investigators with crucial audio evidence when the property owner, a weekend resident who had been in Albuquerque during the incident, provided footage from the previous weekend that had captured a heated argument between Emma and her father. "Your spending is out of control, Emma," Judge Wright's voice could be heard clearly in the recording as he and his daughter stood in the driveway of their lake house. "Your midterm grades are unacceptable, and I won't continue funding this entitled behavior. The allowance is suspended until I see real improvement." Emma's response came through with equal clarity, her tone venomous as she spat back, "You can't do this to me. That money is mine." "You never did this to Thomas. You always give him whatever he wants." As the investigation pieced together the events of March 5th, a timeline emerged that contradicted Emma's initial statement at almost every point, revealing a cold-blooded double murder motivated by financial grievance and jealousy. According to the evidence, after Judge Wright informed Emma that her $500 weekly allowance was suspended due to her failing grades, she began researching inheritance law and planning her father's murder, likely unaware that her 14-year-old brother would also be at the dock that morning. Security footage, recovered text messages, and forensic evidence suggested that Emma disabled the dock camera before attacking her father with the boat anchor, striking him in the back of the head with enough force to cause the fatal skull fracture identified by Dr. Patel. Thomas, who had either witnessed the attack or discovered his father's body, became an unplanned second victim, likely drowned by Emma to eliminate the only witness to her crime. The Bernalillo County Courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity as members of the press, legal observers, and a curious public gathered for Emma Wright's preliminary hearing, the case having captured national attention due to both the shocking nature of the crime and the prominence of the Wright family in legal circles. Prosecutor Jackson Davis arrived early, his tall frame commanding respect as he navigated through the security checkpoint, nodding grimly to colleagues who understood the weight of prosecuting the daughter of a man many of them had appeared before in court. "We'll be filing a motion to try Emma Wright as an adult," Davis informed the assembled reporters outside the courthouse steps, his voice steady despite the barrage of camera flashes. The premeditation and brutality of these murders, combined with the defendant's efforts to cover up her crimes, warrant the most serious charges and consequences available under New Mexico law. Inside the courtroom, Emma Wright appeared vastly different from the composed teenager who had initially greeted first responders at the lake house, her designer clothes replaced by a plain navy dress selected by her defense attorney to project innocence and youth, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her makeup minimal enough to emphasize her age without the sophisticated styling she typically preferred. Defense attorney Margaret Chen, a high-profile criminal lawyer known for handling wealthy clients, sat beside Emma at the defense table, whispering instructions as the courtroom filled with spectators, many of whom were fellow judges and attorneys who had worked with Richard Wright during his distinguished career. The weight of generational legal knowledge hung heavy in the room, with many observers noting the irony that Emma Wright was facing justice in the very system her family had helped shape over 3 generations, her great-grandfather having served on the New Mexico Supreme Court, her grandfather as a federal prosecutor, and her father as the most recent judicial appointment in the family's impressive legacy. The state will demonstrate that on March 5, 2022, the defendant, Emma Wright, committed 2 counts of first-degree murder with deliberate intent and premeditation, Prosecutor Davis began, his opening statement laying out the foundation of the case against the teenager who sat expressionless at the defense table. "We will present evidence showing that in the days leading up to these murders, Emma Wright conducted numerous internet searches related to inheritance laws, life insurance policies for minors, and methods of causing fatal head trauma, demonstrating clear premeditation. Davis methodically outlined the state's evidence from the Instagram selfie that placed Emma at the scene during the time she claimed to be discovering the bodies to the bleached anchor found hidden in the garage. Each piece fitting together to form a comprehensive picture of a teenager who had meticulously planned her father's murder after he cut off her $500 weekly allowance. Judge Maria Gutierrez, assigned to the preliminary hearing after all local judges recused themselves due to their professional relationships with Richard Wright, listened attentively as Davis presented the physical and digital evidence gathered by the investigation team. Your Honor, the state wishes to introduce ring camera footage from a neighboring property, captured 6 days prior to the murders, Davis said, nodding to a technical assistant who queued up the audio recording on the courtroom sound system. The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Wright's voice filled the room. Emma, your midterm report shows you're failing 3 classes and barely passing the others. I've been more than patient, but I'm cutting off your allowance until your grades improve significantly. Emma's response followed, her voice dripping with contempt. This is so unfair. You never do this to Thomas? Judge Wright's measured reply came next. Thomas has a 4.0 GPA and just got accepted to that summer program at UNM Law. He works hard for his achievements, Emma. Something you might want to try. Defense attorney Chen objected strenuously to the admission of the ring camera audio, arguing that it was prejudicial and presented without proper context. But Judge Gutierrez overruled the objection after Davis established the recording's authenticity and relevance to motive. The state will now present evidence regarding the defendant's internet search history in the week preceding the murders, Davis continued, displaying a series of slides showing Emma's queries, including how much money do I get if my parent dies and how to make drowning look like an accident. The courtroom murmured in shock at the calculated nature of the searches, with several jurors visibly disturbed by the evidence that a 16-year-old girl had so thoroughly researched killing her remaining parent after having already lost her mother to cancer 3 years earlier. When Detective Caleb Roberts took the stand as the state's primary witness, his testimony methodically dismantled Emma Wright's initial account of the morning of March 5th, point by devastating point. The defendant claimed she was studying in her room when she discovered her father and brother drowned in the lake at approximately 9:30 a.m. But her own social media activity directly contradicts this, Roberts explained, referring to evidence photos as he spoke. At 9:43 a.m., 13 minutes after she claimed to have found her family members dead, Emma Wright posted this selfie to Instagram showing herself at the dock, smiling, with no indication of distress. The detective continued by describing the forensic evidence recovered from the scene, including blood evidence matching Richard Wright, found on the boat anchor, despite Emma's attempts to clean it with bleach, footprint analysis, placing her at the water's edge, despite her claims of not approaching the area. And the 43-minute delay before calling 911, which cell phone records showed she used to delete incriminating texts and stage the scene to appear as an accident. The preliminary hearing reached its emotional peak when Davis called Thomas Wright's academic advisor to the stand, establishing the stark contrast between the siblings that appeared to fuel Emma's resentment. Thomas was an exceptional student with a bright future ahead of him, the advisor testified, her voice breaking slightly as she recalled the enthusiastic freshman. He had just been notified that he was going to inherit a significant educational trust from his grandmother, earmarked specifically for law school, as she had recognized his academic dedication and interest in continuing the family's legal tradition. The statement appeared to trigger a reaction from Emma for the first time since the hearing began, a flash of anger crossing her face before she quickly composed herself. The momentary break in her carefully constructed facade not lost on Judge Gutierrez, who observed the defendant with the experienced eye that had seen countless guilty parties attempt to maintain innocence in her courtroom. The defense's cross-examination focused on Emma's age and what Chen characterized as typical teenage behaviors that were being misinterpreted by the prosecution. "Isn't it common for teenagers to research random topics online out of curiosity?" Chen asked Detective Roberts, attempting to normalize Emma's disturbing search history. "And couldn't the Instagram post be explained as a delayed upload from earlier in the day?" Roberts remained steadfast in his testimony, explaining that the metadata from the photo confirmed it was taken and uploaded at 9:43 a.m. from the dock location, not pre-scheduled or delayed. Furthermore, Roberts added, the defendant's phone contained deleted text messages to a friend named Zoe sent at 9:52 a.m., stating, "It's done," and "no more daddy issues," which is inconsistent with someone who had just tragically discovered their family members drowned. As the preliminary hearing concluded its first day, the evidence against Emma Wright had mounted to a level that even seasoned legal observers found overwhelming, with courthouse analysts predicting that Judge Gutierrez would almost certainly bind the case over for trial and grant the prosecution's motion to try Emma as an adult. Outside the courtroom, crowds of reporters surrounded Jackson Davis as he delivered a brief statement reiterating the state's position that the murders of Richard and Thomas Wright were calculated acts deserving of the most serious consequences. "This case represents an unthinkable betrayal of family bonds," Davis told the assembled media, his expression grim as cameras flashed around him. "The evidence shows that Emma Wright murdered her father and brother not in a moment of passion or mental distress, but as part of a cold, calculated plan to access family money after her allowance was suspended due to poor academic performance." The motion hearing to determine whether Emma Wright would be tried as an adult transformed the Bernalillo County Courthouse into a fortress of security, with additional officers stationed throughout the building and metal detectors recalibrated to their highest sensitivity. Judge Maria Gutierrez entered the packed courtroom at precisely 9:00 a.m., her robes rustling as she took her seat at the bench, the weight of the decision before her evident in her solemn expression as she surveyed the gallery where members of Albuquerque's legal community sat alongside national media representatives who had descended upon New Mexico to cover what CNN had dubbed the Lakeside Heiress murder case. The judge began the proceedings by acknowledging the unusual circumstances of having a visiting judge preside over such a high-profile local case, explaining that she had been brought in from Santa Fe specifically to ensure impartiality, given that the victim had mentored or worked with most of the judges in Bernalillo County during his distinguished career as both an attorney and jurist. In considering whether to grant the state's motion to try the defendant as an adult, this court must weigh several factors, including the seriousness of the alleged offense, the sophistication and maturity of the juvenile, previous delinquency records, and the prospects for rehabilitation within the juvenile justice system, Judge Gutierrez stated, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Emma Wright sat at the defense table, her appearance once again carefully crafted to emphasize her youth, wearing a Peter Pan collared dress in pale blue that made her look younger than her 16 years, though the effect was somewhat undermined by her clear composure and the calculating gaze she directed at each witness. Defense attorney Margaret Chen had assembled a team of psychological experts prepared to testify that Emma's actions stemmed from untreated grief over her mother's death and the pressure of living in her academically successful brother's shadow, arguments designed to keep the case in juvenile court where Emma would face a significantly shorter sentence and potential release at age 21. Prosecutor Jackson Davis approached the podium with a stack of evidence files, his expression grave as he prepared to present the state's case for adult certification. "Your Honor, The heinous nature of these crimes alone warrants transfer to adult court, but when combined with the extensive evidence of premeditation, there can be no doubt that Emma Wright understood exactly what she was doing when she murdered her father and brother, Davis began, his voice resonating with conviction. The defendant didn't act impulsively or in a moment of teenage angst. She researched inheritance law, life insurance policies, and methods of murder for days before executing her plan. Davis proceeded to call Dr. Marcus Washington, the medical examiner who had conducted the autopsies on Richard and Thomas Wright, whose testimony would introduce disturbing new details about the manner of the victims' deaths that had not been disclosed during the preliminary hearing. Dr. Washington approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had testified in hundreds of trials, his salt-and-pepper beard and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an air of scholarly authority as he was sworn in. Dr. Washington, can you please describe your findings regarding the cause of death for Richard Wright? Davis asked, displaying autopsy photos on monitors visible to the judge and attorneys, but mercifully shielded from the gallery's view. Richard Wright died from blunt force trauma to the occipital region of the skull, consistent with being struck with significant force by an object later identified as a boat anchor, the medical examiner explained, pointing to diagrams of the skull fracture pattern. The fracture pattern indicates he was struck from behind with a downward motion, suggesting he was unaware of the attack and had no opportunity to defend himself. Dr. Washington went on to explain that while Richard Wright's lungs contained water, indicating he had been placed in the lake while still alive but unconscious, the head injury itself was so severe that it would have been fatal regardless of submersion. The courtroom grew even more somber as Dr. Washington turned to the autopsy findings for 14-year-old Thomas Wright, whose death appeared to have unfolded differently than his father's. Thomas Wright's cause of death was asphyxiation due to drowning, with water in the lungs and other classic indicators of a drowning victim, he testified, referring to his detailed report. However, Thomas also had defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, as well as bruising consistent with being forcibly held underwater, suggesting he was conscious and fighting for his life during the drowning. Dr. Bede Washington further noted that fibers recovered from beneath Thomas's fingernails matched a cashmere sweater that Emma had been wearing that morning, according to security footage, indicating a physical struggle between the siblings before Thomas's death. Based on the physical evidence and timeline established by investigators, it appears that Thomas Wright was likely not part of the original murder plan, but was killed after witnessing what happened to his father or interrupting the act itself. The forensic testimony continued with Albuquerque Police Department's lead forensic analyst, Dr. Sophia Patel, who presented the court with a comprehensive analysis of the crime scene evidence, including the boat anchor that had been recovered from the garage. Despite the defendant's attempts to clean the murder weapon with bleach, we were able to recover blood evidence from the crevices of the anchor that matched Richard Wright's DNA profile, Dr. Patel explained, displaying high-resolution images of the microscopic blood traces that had survived Emma's cleaning efforts. Additionally, we found blood spatter patterns on the dock consistent with an overhead swing of the anchor, striking the victim while he was seated or kneeling, likely while he was preparing fishing equipment as indicated by the position of the tackle box. The forensic analyst methodically walked through the timeline established by physical evidence, explaining how the blood pattern analysis, footprint evidence, and digital data from Emma's phone, and the security system painted a clear picture of calculated murder rather than tragic accident. Defense attorney Chen's cross-examination focused on attempting to introduce ambiguity into the timeline and suggesting alternative scenarios for the physical evidence. But Dr. Patel remained unshaken in her analysis. Ms. Chen, the evidence simply doesn't support a scenario where these deaths were accidental. the forensic analyst stated firmly when pressed on whether Richard Wright could have fallen and struck his head accidentally. The angle and force of the impact, combined with the fact that the anchor was removed from the boathouse, cleaned with bleach, and hidden in the garage, all point to deliberate action rather than accident or coincidence. When Chen suggested that perhaps an unknown third party could have committed the murders, Dr. Patel responded by highlighting the security camera footage showing no other individuals entering or leaving the property that morning, as well as Emma's own Instagram selfie placing her at the scene during the crucial time period. After 3 days of testimony focusing on the forensic evidence, psychological evaluations, and Emma's academic and behavioral history, Judge Gutierrez delivered her ruling on the motion to transfer the case to adult court. Having carefully considered all evidence and arguments presented, this court finds that the state has met its burden of establishing that the interests of both the public and the defendant will be best served by transferring this case to adult criminal court, the judge announced, her voice firm as she read from her written decision. The alleged crimes demonstrate a level of premeditation, sophistication, and brutality that goes well beyond typical juvenile offenses, and the evidence suggests the defendant was fully aware of the nature and consequences of her actions. Emma's expression remained impassive as the judge continued, explaining that while the court acknowledged her young age, the nature of her alleged crimes, murdering her father over financial restrictions and then killing her brother to eliminate a witness, indicated a degree of calculated malice that the juvenile system was not designed to address. As news of Judge Gutierrez's decision spread through media outlets across the country, the focus shifted to what would happen next in the case that had captivated public attention with its tragic intersection of privilege, family dynamics, and cold-blooded violence. Prosecutor Jackson Davis met with his team to prepare for the arraignment in adult court, knowing that the stakes had now risen significantly for Emma Wright, who would face potential life imprisonment rather than release at age 21 if convicted. The forensic evidence is solid, but we need to ensure the jury understands the psychological aspect, how a 16-year-old honor student from one of New Mexico's most respected legal families could methodically plan and execute the murder of her father and brother over what essentially amounts to pocket money for someone of her economic status, Davis told his team as they reviewed case files in his office. This case is about more than just the physical evidence. It's about a profound moral vacancy that allowed her to value $500 a week over the lives of her only remaining family members. Defense attorney Margaret Chen immediately filed notice of her intent to appeal the transfer decision while simultaneously preparing for the reality that Emma Wright would likely be tried as an adult. Emma is still a child who has experienced significant trauma, losing her mother at a formative age, and struggling to meet the impossibly high standards set by her family's legacy, Chen told reporters gathered outside the courthouse following Judge Gutierrez's ruling. We maintain that this tragedy stems from untreated grief and emotional distress, not the cold calculation the prosecution alleges. Behind closed doors, however, Chen was reportedly struggling with her client's continued lack of remorse or emotional response to the proceedings, with courthouse sources claiming that Emma seemed more concerned with her media portrayal and whether she would have access to makeup before court appearances than with the substance of her defense or the gravity of the charges against her. The national media descended upon Albuquerque in full force as Emma Wright's case moved to adult court, with cable news channels setting up permanent encampments outside the Bernalillo County Courthouse and renting nearby storefronts as temporary studios for their coverage of what had become known as the Wright family tragedy. Major networks dispatched their top legal correspondents to provide daily analysis of the proceedings, while true crime documentarians began research for inevitable productions about the case, interviewing anyone connected to the Wright family who was willing to speak on camera. The media frenzy reached such proportions that Judge Gutierrez was forced to issue a gag order restricting what attorneys, witnesses, and court personnel could share publicly, concerned that the intense coverage could impact the ability to seat an impartial jury when the case eventually went to trial. Despite these restrictions, details about Emma Wright's life before the murders emerged through investigative reporting and social media archives, painting a picture of a privileged teenager who had increasingly resented the academic and behavioral expectations placed upon her by her father. Emma Wright's Instagram account reveals a lifestyle of extreme privilege and entitlement, reported CNN's legal analyst, displaying screenshots from Emma's social media where she had documented shopping sprees, luxury vacations, and expensive restaurant meals, often with captions complaining about her father's outdated expectations or comparing her allowance unfavorably to those of her wealthy friends. Former classmates from Albuquerque Academy, the prestigious private school where both Wright children had been enrolled, came forward with stories of Emma's academic struggles and growing behavioral issues following her mother's death from cancer 3 years earlier. She used to be a decent student, but after her mom died, she just stopped trying, one former friend told a local reporter, requesting anonymity due to the sensitive nature of the case. Thomas threw himself into studying even harder after their mom died, almost like he was trying to make her proud, but Emma went the opposite direction, like she just didn't care anymore. Court documents unsealed during pretrial proceedings revealed that Emma Wright had been caught cheating on exams twice in the year preceding the murders, with her father being called to the school for disciplinary meetings that several teachers described as tense and uncomfortable. Judge Wright was understandably upset about the academic dishonesty, but he was always measured and appropriate in his response, stated a filing that included testimony from Emma's English teacher. He made it clear to Emma that there would be consequences at home for her choices at school. But he never raised his voice or acted in a manner that seemed excessive or abusive. The documents also included notes from the school counselor who had been working with Emma since her mother's death, describing a teenager who expresses resentment toward her father's high expectations, and frequently compares herself unfavorably to her brother, whom she perceives as receiving preferential treatment due to his academic success. The contrast between Emma and Thomas Wright became a central focus of both the prosecution's narrative and media coverage, with reporters digging into their drastically different responses to their mother's death and the family expectations that came with being part of Albuquerque's most prominent legal dynasty. Thomas had channeled his grief into academic excellence, volunteer work at a local legal aid clinic, and participation in a youth court program for at-risk teens, following the family tradition of public service and commitment to the law that had defined the right name for 3 generations. Profiles of the murdered 14-year-old painted a picture of a kind, studious boy who had recently been selected for a prestigious summer program at the University of New Mexico Law School, a first step toward what many assumed would eventually be a seat on the bench like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him. Thomas was the embodiment of his family's legacy, even at such a young age, a family friend told reporters outside the courthouse. He had this natural sense of fairness and justice that you can't teach. Emma's resentment of her brother's academic success and their late grandmother's decision to establish a special educational trust specifically for Thomas became key elements of the prosecution's theory of motive, with investigators discovering journal entries and text messages where Emma had complained bitterly about the arrangement. "Gran basically wrote me off because I'm not a straight-A robot like Thomas," she had written to a friend 6 months before the murders, shortly after learning of the trust that would eventually fund Thomas's law school education. "Everyone acts like being a Wright means you have to be obsessed with law and justice and all that boring stuff, but what if I want something different?" The prosecution's theory, supported by Emma's internet search history, suggested that after her father cut off her allowance, she began to view both him and her brother as obstacles to the wealth she believed she deserved, researching whether she would inherit everything as the sole surviving family member. As the trial date approached, prosecutor Jackson Davis filed a motion to introduce evidence of Emma's prior statements and behavior that demonstrated her growing financial obsession in the months following her mother's death. The defendant's focus on material possessions and financial status increased dramatically after losing her mother, manifesting as an entitled attitude toward family wealth that she viewed as rightfully hers, regardless of her behavior or academic performance, Davis wrote in the motion. This perspective is critical to understanding how the relatively small matter of a suspended allowance could trigger such a violent response. The filing included statements from Catherine Wright's sister, Emma's maternal aunt, who described witnessing a disturbing interaction at Catherine's funeral reception, where Emma had asked about her mother's jewelry collection and when she would be able to claim it, showing more interest in the material possessions than in processing her grief. The defense team countered with their own filings seeking to exclude what they termed prejudicial character evidence that painted Emma Wright as materialistic and entitled, rather than focusing on the specific events of March 5, 2022. The prosecution seeks to try Ms. Wright for being a typical teenager with normal interests in fashion and social status, rather than addressing the actual evidence of the alleged crime, Margaret Chen argued in her response. References to the defendant's spending habits, social media presence, or attitudes toward school are irrelevant to the charges and serve only to bias the jury against a young woman who has already been demonized in the press. Chen's strategy appeared to focus on humanizing Emma by contextualizing her behavior as a response to grief, arguing that the death of her mother, at age 13, had triggered depression and behavioral changes that went untreated because her father was focused on his judicial career and his high-achieving son. Judge Eleanor Torres, assigned to preside over the trial after Judge Gutierrez's role concluded with the transfer hearing, ruled partially in favor of both sides on the evidentiary motions, allowing the prosecution to introduce evidence of Emma's statements and internet searches directly related to financial motives and inheritance, but excluding more general character evidence about her social media presence or spending habits. The court will allow evidence that speaks directly to motive and premeditation, but general character evidence meant to portray the defendant as shallow or materialistic will not be permitted, Judge Torres stated in her ruling. This case must be decided on the specific evidence related to the events of March 5, 2022, and the defendant's actions and statements directly connected to those events, not on whether she fits a particular stereotype of privileged youth. As jury selection finally began in September 2022, 6 months after the murders at Cochiti Lake, the case had evolved from a local tragedy to a national conversation about wealth, privilege, family dynamics, and the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders charged with heinous crimes. Potential jurors faced extensive questioning about their exposure to media coverage, their opinions on trying minors as adults, and whether they had any connections to the Wright family or the local legal community that might influence their impartiality. Finding 12 impartial jurors in a community where the victim was a sitting judge will be challenging enough, legal analyst Carmen Rivera commented on national television as footage showed potential jurors filing into the courthouse. But the additional factors of the defendant's age, the family's prominence, and the sensational nature of the crime make this one of the most complex jury selections I've ever observed. The trial of Emma Wright officially began on a crisp October morning with opening statements that presented starkly different narratives of what had transpired at the Wright family's lake house on March 5, 2022. Prosecutor Jackson Davis approached the jury box with measured steps, his tall frame commanding the courtroom, as he prepared to outline the state's case against the 16-year-old defendant, who sat at the defense table wearing a conservative navy dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, looking more like a private school student than someone charged with double murder. This case is about calculation, greed, and the ultimate betrayal of family trust, Davis began, his deep voice resonating through the packed courtroom where every seat was filled with legal observers, journalists, and members of the public who had lined up before dawn to secure a place. The evidence will show that Emma Wright didn't act impulsively or in a moment of teenage anger. She researched, planned, and executed the murders of her father and brother after her $500 weekly allowance was suspended due to poor academic performance. Defense attorney Margaret Chen countered with an opening statement that portrayed Emma as a traumatized child struggling with unresolved grief and the immense pressure of belonging to Albuquerque's most prominent legal family. Emma Wright lost her mother to cancer at age 13, a devastating blow that transformed her from a happy, well-adjusted child into a struggling teenager searching for her identity and place in the world, Chen told the jurors, gesturing toward Emma, who kept her eyes downcast, occasionally dabbing at them with a tissue in what some observers later described as a practiced performance. What happened at Cochiti Lake was a tragic accident that spiraled into chaos, followed by the panic and poor decisions of a frightened child who has now been abandoned by the very community her family served for generations. Chen's narrative suggested that Richard Wright had slipped on the dock and struck his head accidentally, with Thomas drowning while trying to help him, and Emma making regrettable decisions afterward due to shock and fear rather than calculated malice. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Detective Caleb Roberts, who walked the jury through the initial investigation at the lake house, describing the inconsistencies in Emma's statements and the mounting evidence that quickly transformed the case from a tragic accident to a homicide investigation. The defendant claimed she had been studying in her room all morning and discovered the bodies around 9:30 a.m., but security footage showed her leaving the main house at 7:32 a.m. and heading toward the dock shortly after her father and brother, Roberts testified, referring to timeline diagrams displayed on large screens for the jury's benefit. Most tellingly, at 9:43 a.m., 13 minutes after she claimed to have discovered her father and brother dead in the water, Emma Wright posted a selfie to Instagram showing herself at the dock with a casual smile and no signs of distress. Roberts detailed how this digital evidence directly contradicted Emma's initial statement and established that she had lied to first responders about her whereabouts and actions that morning. Technical experts from the Albuquerque Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit provided some of the most damaging testimony against Emma, displaying for the jury the extensive digital trail she had left before and after the murders. In the week prior to March 5th, the defendant conducted numerous searches related to inheritance law, life insurance policies for minors, and methods of causing fatal head trauma, testified Alex Nguyen, the lead digital forensics analyst who had examined Emma's devices. These searches were conducted across multiple devices and browsers, suggesting a deliberate effort to research how to commit murder and potentially benefit financially from the deaths. Nguyen methodically displayed screenshots of Emma's search history, including queries like, how long for life insurance payout after death? Can minors inherit directly? How hard to crack skull with blunt object? And perhaps most damning, can drowning be staged to look accidental? The jury appeared visibly disturbed as Nguyen continued his testimony, detailing the activity on Emma's phone in the 43-minute gap between her discovery of the bodies and her 911 call. During this critical time period, the defendant deleted text messages, conducted searches on how to remove blood from clothing, and posted to social media as if nothing unusual had occurred, the analyst explained, displaying a timeline of Emma's digital activities. At 9:52 a.m., she sent a text message to a friend that read, "It's done," followed by "No more daddy issues," messages she later deleted, but which were recovered through forensic extraction. The technical evidence painted a picture of a teenager who, rather than panicking after finding her family members dead, had methodically attempted to cover her tracks and establish an alternative narrative before finally calling emergency services. The forensic evidence presentation continued with testimony from Dr. Sophia Patel, who had analyzed the physical evidence from the crime scene, including the boat anchor recovered from the garage. Despite the defendant's efforts to clean the murder weapon with bleach, we were able to recover blood evidence matching Richard Wright's DNA profile from the crevices of the anchor, Dr. Patel testified, displaying microscopic images of the recovered blood samples. The spatter pattern analysis on the dock indicates the victim was struck from behind while in a seated or kneeling position, consistent with someone who was unaware of the impending attack and had no opportunity to defend himself. Dr. Patel further explained that the bleach bottle found in the garage contained Emma's fingerprints and had been recently emptied, with bleach residue still present on the floor drain, indicating a hasty cleaning attempt shortly after the murders. The most dramatic moment of the prosecution's case came with the testimony of Emma's former best friend, Zoe Patterson, who had received the incriminating text messages on the morning of the murders, but had initially been too afraid to come forward. Emma had been complaining about her dad cutting off her allowance for weeks, saying it wasn't fair and that he was trying to control her, Zoe testified, visibly nervous as she avoided making eye contact with Emma at the defense table. The night before it happened, she texted me saying, "After tomorrow, I won't have to worry about money ever again," but I just thought she meant she was going to convince her dad to change his mind. Zoe's voice trembled as she recounted receiving the messages, "It's done," and "No more daddy issues" on the morning of March 5th, explaining that she hadn't understood their significance until she heard about the deaths later that day, and even then had been too shocked and frightened to immediately contact authorities. Cross-examination by defense attorney Chen attempted to characterize the text messages as typical teenage hyperbole rather than evidence of murder, suggesting that "it's done" could have referred to a conversation with her father about the allowance rather than his death. Didn't Emma often use dramatic language when texting? Chen asked Zoe, who reluctantly acknowledged that Emma had a tendency toward exaggeration in her communications. Could daddy issues have been a reference to her ongoing disagreements with her father rather than something more sinister? Despite Chen's efforts to introduce ambiguity into the interpretation of the messages, Zoe's testimony remained largely unshaken, particularly when redirect examination by Prosecutor Davis established that Emma had never before used phrases like "it's done" in their years of friendship, and that the timing of the messages precisely coincided with the established timeline of the murders. The prosecution's case culminated with testimony from financial experts who detailed the significant inheritance Emma Wright stood to receive as the sole surviving member of her immediate family. Between life insurance policies, trust funds established by her grandparents, and the direct inheritance of her father's estate, the defendant would eventually control assets valued at approximately $7 million, testified financial analyst Rebecca Goldman, explaining the complex legal structures that governed the Wright family wealth. While some of these assets would be held in trust until she reached the age of 25, Emma Wright would immediately gain access to a monthly income significantly larger than the allowance that had been suspended by her father, and would have influence over investment decisions regarding the larger estate. Goldman further testified that prior to her mother's death, Catherine Wright had established separate educational trusts for both children, but Emma had already depleted much of hers through a provision allowing withdrawals for educational enrichment activities, which she had used primarily for international travel that had little educational component. As the prosecution rested its case after 2 weeks of testimony, legal analysts widely agreed that the state had presented a compelling narrative supported by substantial physical, digital, and testimonial evidence. The prosecution has methodically established motive, means, opportunity, and most importantly, premeditation, commented legal analyst David Cohen on the courthouse steps during a midday recess. They've shown that Emma Wright was angry about her allowance being cut off, researched how to kill her father and benefit financially, carried out the murders with a weapon she later attempted to clean and hide, and then tried to establish an alibi through deception and staged evidence. The defense faced the daunting task of countering this narrative, with Margaret Chen announcing that Emma Wright would testify in her own defense, a high-risk strategy that would subject the teenager to what promised to be intense cross-examination by Jackson Davis, whose reputation for methodical dismantling of dishonest witnesses had been established through decades of successful prosecutions. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as the defense began presenting its case, with spectators arriving hours before proceedings began to secure seats for what many expected would be Emma Wright's testimony. Defense attorney Margaret Chen opened with a series of expert witnesses intended to create reasonable doubt about the prosecution's timeline and forensic conclusions, beginning with Dr. Lionel Patterson, a forensic pathologist who specialized in drowning cases. Blunt force trauma followed by drowning creates complex forensic scenarios that can be misinterpreted, Dr. Patterson testified, suggesting that Richard Wright's head injury could have resulted from falling against the dock before entering the water, rather than being struck with the anchor. The pattern of injury is consistent with impact against a hard, straight edge like the side of a dock, particularly if the victim fell from a standing position. The expert's testimony directly contradicted the prosecution's medical examiner, who had specifically ruled out such a scenario based on the angle and depth of the skull fracture. Cross-examination by prosecutor Jackson Davis quickly exposed flaws in Dr. Patterson's alternative theory, particularly when confronted with the detailed blood spatter analysis that showed directionality inconsistent with a fall. Doctor, are you suggesting that Judge Wright somehow fell with enough force to create the specific fracture pattern documented in the autopsy, and then the boat anchor coincidentally disappeared from its storage place, was found with his blood in its crevices, despite being bleached, and happened to be hidden in the garage? Davis asked, his tone conveying the implausibility of the scenario. Dr. Patterson's credibility was further damaged when Davis established that the expert had not personally examined the body or visited the crime scene, basing his opinions solely on photographs and reports, and had previously testified for the defense in several high-profile cases where his alternative theories had been rejected by juries who ultimately convicted the defendants. The defense attempted to shift focus to Emma's psychological state following her mother's death 3 years earlier, calling child psychologist Dr. Elena Gomez to testify about the impact of parental loss on adolescent development. When a teenager loses a parent during the critical developmental period of early adolescence, it can dramatically alter their emotional regulation, decision-making abilities, and relationship with authority figures, Dr. Gomez explained, having reviewed Emma's school records and counseling notes, but never having personally treated her. Emma Wright exhibited classic signs of unresolved grief following her mother's death, including academic decline, increased conflict with her surviving parent, and resentment toward her higher-achieving sibling. Dr. Gomez suggested that Emma's actions following the deaths at the lake house, including the delay in calling 911 and attempts to clean up evidence, could be explained by panic and dissociation rather than calculated deception. Davis's cross-examination of Dr. Gomez focused on distinguishing between normal grief responses and premeditated murder, establishing that the psychologist had never evaluated Emma personally, and that her theories did not account for the extensive planning evident in Emma's internet searches and preparations. Doctor, in your professional experience, do grieving teenagers typically research inheritance law, life insurance policies, and methods of causing fatal head trauma in the week before experiencing a panic response to finding family members dead? Davis asked pointedly. Dr. Rice Gomez conceded that such research was not typical of grief responses and that Emma's internet searches suggested deliberate planning rather than impulsive action, though she maintained that underlying grief and trauma could have contributed to a distorted decision-making process that led to these searches in the first place. As the defense case continued, Chen called several of Emma's teachers and friends to testify about changes in her behavior following her mother's death, attempting to build a narrative of a troubled teenager struggling with loss, rather than a calculating killer. Emma's chemistry teacher described how she had gone from an A student to barely passing after her mother died, while her school counselor testified about Emma's increasing resentment toward her father's strict academic expectations. Emma often expressed feeling that nothing she did would ever measure up to her brother's achievements, the counselor stated, describing sessions where Emma had broken down in tears over her father's comparisons between the siblings. She felt trapped in a family legacy that didn't allow space for her to find her own path or identity outside of academic success and the law. The most anticipated moment of the trial arrived when Margaret Chen called Emma Wright to the stand, a strategic decision that many legal observers considered high risk given the substantial evidence against her and Prosecutor Davis's reputation for devastating cross-examinations. Emma approached the witness stand wearing a simple light blue dress and minimal makeup, her demeanor subdued in contrast to her often defiant courtroom expressions during previous testimony. Emma, in your own words, can you tell the court what happened at the lake house on the morning of March 5th? Chen asked after establishing basic biographical information. Emma's voice was soft but steady as she began her account, describing a morning that differed significantly from the prosecution's established timeline. I was in my room studying that morning, but I was struggling to concentrate, Emma testified, her eyes downcast in what appeared to be a rehearsed display of remorse. Around 7:30, I decided to take a break and went down to the dock where Dad and Thomas were getting ready to fish. According to Emma's testimony, she had a brief conversation with her father about her studies before returning to the house, only to come back to the dock approximately 2 hours later to bring them snacks. That's when I found Dad floating in the water and Thomas was nowhere to be seen, she claimed, her voice breaking slightly. I panicked and tried to reach Dad, but I couldn't swim well enough to get to him, and then I saw Thomas floating further out. Emma claimed that her father must have slipped and hit his head on the dock, with Thomas drowning while trying to save him. Emma's testimony directly contradicted virtually all the physical and digital evidence presented by the prosecution, including the timeline established by security footage, the Instagram selfie posted at 9:43 a.m., and the forensic evidence indicating her father had been struck from behind with the boat anchor. When Chen asked about these discrepancies, Emma offered explanations that strained credulity, claiming the security system often showed incorrect timestamps, that her Instagram post had been scheduled earlier but uploaded automatically, and that she had found the bloody anchor floating in the water and hidden it in a panic, fearing she would be blamed for an accident. I know I should have called 911 right away, she testified, a single tear finally tracking down her cheek after nearly 3 weeks of dry-eyed courtroom appearances. I was just so scared and confused, and I didn't want anyone to think I had hurt them when I hadn't. Jackson Davis approached the podium for cross-examination with the measured pace of a prosecutor who knew the strength of his case and had anticipated every element of Emma's testimony. Ms. Wright, you've provided the court with an elaborate explanation for the events of March 5th, he began, his tone neutral but penetrating. However, I'm curious about some of your internet searches in the days leading up to your father and brother's deaths. Davis displayed on the courtroom monitors Emma's search history from the previous week, highlighting queries about inheritance law, life insurance policies, and methods of causing fatal head trauma. Can you explain to the jury why you were researching how to make drowning look accidental 3 days before your father and brother drowned in what you claim was an accident? Emma's composure visibly faltered as Davis methodically walked through her incriminating digital trail, including not only the damning search history, but also the text messages to her friend Zoe, stating, "It's done," and "no more daddy issues," sent shortly after the time of death established by the medical examiner. Those were about something else, Emma claimed weakly, unable to provide a coherent alternative explanation for the timing and content of the messages. Davis pressed further, questioning her about the Ring doorbell audio that had captured her father informing her that her $500 weekly allowance was suspended until her grades improved. "Wasn't it true that you were furious about this financial restriction?" Davis asked, his voice remaining measured but insistent. "So angry, in fact, that you researched how to kill your father and inherit his money." The cross-examination reached its crescendo when Davis displayed the Instagram selfie Emma had posted at 9:43 a.m., showing her smiling at the dock with no sign of distress 13 minutes after she claimed to have discovered her family members dead in the water. "Ms. Wright, do you typically take smiling selfies at crime scenes?" Davis asked, his question hanging in the air as jurors visibly reacted to the disconnect between Emma's testimony and the photographic evidence. "And can you explain why, if you were in such a panic after finding your father and brother drowned, you waited 43 minutes to call 911, time which our digital forensics expert has established? You spent deleting text messages, researching how to remove blood from clothing, and posting to social media." By the time Davis concluded his cross-examination after nearly 4 hours, Emma's carefully constructed alternative narrative had been systematically dismantled, her credibility with the jury visibly shattered as she repeatedly contradicted herself, became evasive, or claimed not to remember details that undermined her version of events. Legal analysts covering the trial described the cross-examination as devastating and the final nail in the defense's coffin, with Emma's decision to testify ultimately strengthening the prosecution's case by highlighting the implausibility of her claims when directly compared to the substantial physical and digital evidence. "Sometimes defense attorneys take a calculated risk putting their client on the stand," commented legal analyst Maria Vasquez, outside the courthouse. In this case, that decision appears to have backfired spectacularly, as Emma Wright's testimony contained so many contradictions and implausible explanations that it likely reinforced the jury's perception of her guilt. As the defense rested its case following Emma's testimony and a few character witnesses who spoke to her previous good behavior before her mother's death, closing arguments were scheduled for the following Monday, giving jurors the weekend to process the 3 weeks of testimony they had heard. The case had captured national attention not only because of the shocking nature of the crime, but also because it forced a reckoning with uncomfortable questions about privilege, family pressure, and the capacity of teenagers to commit premeditated violence. Outside the courthouse, media analysts debated the likely outcome, with most legal experts predicting a guilty verdict based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution and the defense's failure to establish a plausible alternative explanation for the deaths of Richard and Thomas Wright that accounted for the physical evidence, digital trail, and Emma's own incriminating actions before and after the murders. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as attorneys prepared to deliver their closing arguments, the culmination of a trial that had captivated Albuquerque and the nation for nearly a month. Family members of Richard Wright's late wife, Catherine, occupied the front row behind the prosecution table, their faces drawn with the strain of witnessing the trial of their niece for the murder of their brother-in-law and nephew. Local judges who had worked with Richard Wright filled much of the gallery, having obtained permission from Judge Torres to attend the closing arguments despite their professional connections to the victim. Emma Wright sat at the defense table between her attorneys, wearing a simple gray dress with her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable, as she faced what many legal observers believed would be the final day before jury deliberations began. Defense attorney Margaret Chen rose first, approaching the jury with a measured pace and somber expression, her closing argument focusing on reasonable doubt and the alternative narrative she had attempted to construct throughout the trial. The prosecution has presented a case built on circumstantial evidence and a speculation, asking you to believe that a 16-year-old honor student with no history of violence meticulously planned and executed the murders of her father and brother over a temporary financial restriction, Chen began, making eye contact with each juror in turn. What the evidence actually shows is a tragic accident followed by the panic-driven poor decisions of a traumatized teenager who had already lost her mother and suddenly found herself completely alone in the world. Chen methodically addressed the prosecution's evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the internet searches, text messages, and Emma's behavior following the deaths, repeatedly emphasizing her client's youth and the psychological impact of her mother's death 3 years earlier. The prosecution wants you to believe that Emma Wright valued $500 a week over the lives of her only remaining family members, Chen continued, her voice rising with emotion for the first time during the trial. But this theory ignores the complexity of grief, the fragility of adolescent development, and the fundamental principle of our justice system, that the accused is innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Chen concluded by reminding the jury of the devastating consequences of their decision, noting that a guilty verdict would mean sending a 16-year-old to adult prison for a crime that, in her framing, was at worst a tragic accident, compounded by fear-driven mistakes. Emma Wright has already lost her entire family, her mother to cancer, and now her father and brother to a terrible accident. Don't compound this tragedy by sending her to prison for the rest of her life based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. Prosecutor Jackson Davis approached the jury box with the confidence of an experienced litigator who knew the strength of his case, taking a moment to arrange his notes before beginning his closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about speculation or circumstantial evidence, as the defense would have you believe, Davis began, his deep voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. It is about cold, hard facts established through digital forensics, physical evidence, expert testimony, and the defendant's own words and actions. Davis methodically walked through the timeline of the murders, using a large digital display to show how each piece of evidence, from Emma's incriminating internet searches to the blood evidence on the boat anchor to her selfie posted minutes after she claimed to discover the bodies, fit together to form an inescapable conclusion of premeditated murder motivated by financial gain and resentment. The defense has asked you to believe that Judge Wright's skull was fractured in an accidental fall, that the boat anchor coincidentally disappeared from its storage place and was found with his blood in its crevices despite being bleached, that Emma Wright just happened to research inheritance law and methods of causing fatal head trauma days before this accident, and that her text messages saying, "It's done and no more daddy issues," sent minutes after the murders referred to something else entirely, Davis said, his tone conveying the implausibility of this narrative. They're asking you to ignore the fact that Emma Wright waited 43 minutes to call 911 after finding her father and brother allegedly drowned. Time she spent deleting incriminating messages, posting smiling selfies on social media, and attempting to clean blood evidence from the murder weapon. Davis paused, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle over the jurors before continuing with the most damning aspect of the case. Emma Wright murdered her father because he cut off her $500 weekly allowance due to poor academic performance, Davis stated plainly, displaying the Ring camera audio transcript where Judge Wright had informed his daughter of this decision. She resented that her brother Thomas was a straight A student who had secured their grandmother's educational trust, while she had depleted much of her own through frivolous spending. She researched how killing her father would affect her inheritance, discovered she would gain control of significantly more money as the sole surviving family member, and executed a plan to murder him on March 5, 2022. Davis explained that while Thomas's death may not have been part of the original plan, the evidence suggested he had either witnessed his father's murder or discovered the scene afterward, becoming an unplanned second victim when Emma realized he could implicate her. Davis concluded his closing argument by directly addressing the defense's focus on Emma's age and psychological state following her mother's death. The defense has repeatedly emphasized that Emma Wright is 16 years old, as if her youth somehow negates the calculated nature of these murders or diminishes her responsibility for her actions, he said, his tone firm but not unsympathetic. But the evidence shows that Emma Wright did not act impulsively or without understanding the consequences of her actions. She researched, planned, and executed the murders of her father and brother, then methodically attempted to cover her tracks. Davis turned to face the jury directly, his expression solemn. The loss of her mother was indeed tragic, but it does not explain or excuse the deliberate taking of two innocent lives for financial gain. Richard and Thomas Wright deserve justice, and that justice requires holding Emma Wright fully accountable for her actions, regardless of her age. Judge Torres delivered her instructions to the jury following the closing arguments, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the concept of reasonable doubt, and the specific findings they would need to make in order to reach a verdict. You must consider only the evidence presented in this courtroom and the law as I have explained it to you, the judge reminded them, her voice clear and authoritative. You must set aside any personal feelings, biases, or preconceptions you may have about the defendant's age, family background, or the nature of the crime. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, legal analysts predicted they would likely take several days to work through the extensive evidence and testimony presented during the trial, particularly given the high-profile nature of the case and the gravity of potentially sentencing a 16-year-old to life imprisonment. Contrary to these predictions, the jury returned after just 7 hours of deliberation, a surprisingly short time given the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence they had been asked to consider. The courtroom fell silent as the jurors filed in, their expressions grave as they took their seats, studiously avoiding eye contact with Emma Wright, who sat rigid at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Torres asked, her voice the only sound in the hushed courtroom. The jury four-person, a middle-aged high school teacher with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stood and replied, "We have, Your Honor," handing the verdict form to the bailiff who delivered it to the judge for review, before returning it to the four-person to be read aloud. In the case of the state of New Mexico versus Emma Wright, on the count of first-degree murder of Richard Wright, we find the defendant guilty, the four-person announced, her voice steady but solemn as a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. On the count of first-degree murder of Thomas Wright, we find the defendant guilty. Emma Wright showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, her expression as impassive as it had been throughout much of the trial, while behind her, Members of her extended family quietly wept at the final confirmation of the tragedy that had torn apart their family. Judge Torres thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and pre-sentencing reports that would inform her decision regarding Emma Wright's punishment. The sentencing hearing on December 10, 2022, drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself, with court officers forced to create an overflow room with video feeds to accommodate the public and media interest in the case's conclusion. Victim impact statements were delivered by Richard Wright's brother, Catherine Wright's sister, and several colleagues from the judicial community who spoke about the professional and personal loss created by the murders. Richard Wright was not just my brother, he was a pillar of this community and a devoted father who did his best to raise his children alone after losing his beloved wife to cancer, James Wright stated, his voice breaking with emotion as he addressed the court. And Thomas, a bright, kind boy with his whole life ahead of him, was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps because he stood to inherit what his sister felt entitled to without earning it. Judge Torres listened attentively to each statement, her expression somber as the full impact of the murders on the community and extended family was articulated before the court. When all victim statements had been presented, she turned her attention to Emma Wright, who would have the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. Ms. Wright, you have the right to make a statement to this court before I pronounce sentence, Judge Torres explained. You are not required to do so, and your decision will not impact the sentence I impose, but this is your opportunity to speak if you wish to do so. Emma conferred briefly with her attorney before rising to her feet, her expression composed as she faced the judge directly, seemingly unaffected by the emotional victim impact statements that had preceded her. Your Honor, I maintain my innocence despite the jury's verdict, Emma began, her voice clear and unwavering, in a statement that immediately sent murmurs through the courtroom. I loved my father and brother, and I would never have harmed them. What happened at the lake was a terrible accident that I will have to live with for the rest of my life. Emma's brief statement contained no apology, no expression of remorse, and no acknowledgement of the overwhelming evidence that had led to her conviction, confirming for many observers what the prosecution had argued throughout the trial, that Emma Wright showed a profound lack of empathy and moral understanding despite her youth and privileged upbringing. Judge Torres listened to Emma's statement without visible reaction before beginning her sentencing remarks, her expression grave as she addressed the convicted teenager standing before her. Emma Wright, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of your father, Richard Wright, and your brother, Thomas Wright, the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. In my 23 years on the bench, I have presided over many murder trials, but few have disturbed me as deeply as this case. Judge Torres went on to detail the calculated nature of the crimes, the extensive evidence of premeditation, and Emma's complete lack of remorse or accountability even after conviction, describing the murders as a profound betrayal of the most fundamental trust between family members, motivated by material greed and selfish entitlement. The law provides me with a range of sentencing options, even for crimes as serious as these, Judge Torres continued, acknowledging Emma's age as a factor she had carefully considered. However, the premeditated nature of these murders, the attempt to cover up your crimes, and your continued refusal to accept responsibility or show remorse compel me to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. The judge's voice took on additional gravity as she delivered her final ruling. On each count of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. As murmurs rippled through the courtroom, Judge Torres added with unmistakable finality, Ms. Wright, given the nature of your crimes and your demonstrated lack of rehabilitation potential, you will never leave prison." The pronouncement of Emma Wright's sentence reverberated through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The judge's words, "You will never leave prison," hanging in the air as spectators, journalists, and legal professionals absorbed the finality of the moment. For the first time since her arrest, Emma's composure cracked visibly, her eyes widening and color draining from her face, as the reality of spending the rest of her life behind bars finally penetrated the psychological armor she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Defense attorney Margaret Chen immediately announced her intention to appeal both the conviction and the sentence, citing Emma's age and arguing that life without parole for a juvenile offender constituted cruel and unusual punishment regardless of the crimes committed. "This case will continue through the appeals process," Chen told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "We believe the Supreme Court's evolving standards regarding juvenile sentencing will ultimately provide relief for our client." Prosecutor Jackson Davis held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps following the sentencing, surrounded by members of his team and representatives from the Albuquerque Police Department, including Detective Caleb Roberts, who had led the investigation from its first hours. "Today, justice has been served for Richard and Thomas Wright," Davis stated, his expression solemn despite the successful prosecution. "While nothing can bring them back or heal the wounds inflicted on their extended family and our community, the sentence imposed ensures that Emma Wright will never again have the opportunity to harm others." Davis thanked the investigative team, particularly highlighting the Digital Forensics Unit, whose meticulous work had uncovered the damning evidence of premeditation that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. This case demonstrates that in the digital age, the truth leaves traces that cannot be easily erased, even by those who believe themselves clever enough to outsmart justice. The case of Emma Wright sparked national debates about juvenile justice, family dynamics in high-achieving households, and the psychological impact of parental loss during adolescence, with experts across disciplines weighing in on the factors that could lead a privileged 16-year-old to murder her family over what many characterized as a relatively minor financial restriction. The Wright case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about entitlement and materialism in affluent families, noted child psychologist Dr. Samantha Reyes in a television panel discussion following the sentencing. While most teenagers, even those experiencing grief or resentment, would never resort to violence, this case highlights how the combination of unprocessed trauma, perceived injustice, and fixation on material wealth can create a perfect storm of dangerous thinking in a developing brain. Richard and Thomas Wright were laid to rest in a private ceremony at Sunset Memorial Park in Albuquerque, their graves placed beside Catherine Wright, who had preceded them in death 3 years earlier. The family reunited in death after being torn apart by violence. The Wright family home on the eastern edge of the Sandia Mountains was sold, the proceeds placed in trust for charitable causes according to provisions in Richard Wright's will that activated in the event that neither of his children could inherit. The lake house at Cochiti Lake, where the murders had taken place, remained unsold, its value diminished by the notorious crime that had occurred there, its empty rooms and silent dock standing as a grim monument to the tragedy that had unfolded on its shores on that March morning in 2022. Detective Caleb Roberts returned to the lake house one final time before the case was officially closed, standing on the dock where Richard and Thomas Wright had lost their lives as the sun set over the water, casting long shadows across the property that had once been a place of family gatherings and tradition. In 15 years of homicide investigation, this case got to me in ways others haven't, Roberts later confided to his partner, Detective Sanchez, during a rare moment of reflection over drinks at an Albuquerque bar frequented by law enforcement. Maybe it's because of her age, or the cold calculation behind it all, or just the waste of 3 lives. Richard and Thomas dead, and Emma effectively dead too, spending the rest of her life in prison. Roberts had interviewed hundreds of killers during his career, but few had disturbed him as profoundly as Emma Wright, whose apparent lack of emotional connection to her crimes suggested a moral vacancy that he struggled to comprehend, particularly in someone so young. The media fascination with the case continued long after the sentencing, with multiple books, documentaries, and a feature film in development exploring the Wright family tragedy from various angles. Journalists dug deeper into the 3-generation legal dynasty that had shaped New Mexico's judicial landscape, examining how the pressure of legacy and expectation might have contributed to the perfect storm of circumstances that led to the murders. Catherine Wright's battle with cancer became a focus of psychological analysis, with experts speculating about how her death had affected her children differently. Thomas channeling his grief into academic achievement, and Emma's emotional development apparently arrested by the trauma, leaving her fixated on material comforts and resentful of perceived slights or restrictions. Emma Wright was transferred to the New Mexico Women's Correctional Facility in Grants, approximately 80 miles west of Albuquerque, where she would begin serving her dual life sentences at the age of 16, the youngest inmate in the facility's history. Prison officials created a specialized housing arrangement due to her age, placing her in a section separate from the general population, while her legal team pursued appeals based on her juvenile status at the time of the crimes. Reports from correctional officers described Emma as withdrawn and sullen, interacting minimally with staff, and refusing to participate in educational or therapeutic programs offered to her. She still doesn't seem to grasp the reality of her situation, noted one prison psychologist in an assessment report. There is a disconnect between her actions and her understanding of consequences that speaks to a concerning lack of emotional development or moral framework. The Wright case became a cautionary tale in Albuquerque's affluent communities, prompting schools and family counseling centers to develop programs addressing grief management, healthy family communication, and the psychological pitfalls of materialism and entitlement among privileged youth. Richard Wright's colleagues on the bench established a memorial scholarship in his name at the University of New Mexico Law School, specifically designed to support students interested in juvenile justice reform and adolescent mental health initiatives within the legal system. Thomas Wright's academic achievements were commemorated through a science and mathematics program at Albuquerque Academy, providing opportunities for promising students who shared his passion for learning and public service but lacked the financial resources to attend the prestigious private school. As months passed and the intense media attention gradually subsided, the people of Albuquerque struggled to reconcile the brutal facts of the case with their understanding of their community and its values. The Wright family had been respected pillars of society, embodiments of the American dream of generational achievement and success, their 3-generation legal dynasty representing the best of public service and professional accomplishment. That this legacy could end so tragically with a 16-year-old girl murdering her father and brother over a suspended allowance forced a collective reckoning with questions about wealth, privilege, and the moral education of children raised with material abundance, but perhaps spiritual or emotional poverty. The Wright case makes us uncomfortable because it contradicts our belief that providing children with every advantage guarantees they'll develop into moral, empathetic adults, observed Rabbi David Silverman during a community forum on the case's impact. It reminds us that character and conscience require cultivation beyond material provision, perhaps especially in contexts of privilege where consequences for bad behavior can seem remote or negotiable. On the first anniversary of the murders, Detective Caleb Roberts stood once more at Cochiti Lake, watching the sun rise over the water, just as it had on the morning he was called to investigate what would become one of New Mexico's most notorious crimes. The Wright family compound had finally sold after months on the market at a fraction of its value, the new owners already making plans to demolish the existing structures and build anew, hoping to erase the physical reminders of the tragedy that had occurred there. As Roberts prepared to leave the site for what he knew would be the last time, he reflected on the case that had defined his career and the lingering questions about human nature it had raised for him. Some cases you solve completely, you understand what happened and why it happened, and you can file them away in your mind, he murmured to himself as he took a final look at the dock where it had all begun. But this one, I'll never fully understand how someone so young could be so calculating, so empty inside, that killing her own family seemed like an acceptable solution to a temporary problem. With that thought, Roberts turned away from the lake and walked back to his car, leaving behind the site of the Wright family tragedy, but carrying with him the profound disquiet it had etched into his understanding of the darkness that could lurk behind even the most privileged facades.